Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Rubrics in World Language Classrooms. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. After we introduce ourselves, we'll go over the basics of rubrics before taking a deep dive into creating, using, and aligning your own rubrics. We'll wrap up with a summary and discussion of what we covered today, and we'll share some resources for you at the end. My name is Leslie Fink. I'm a senior research assistant at the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I'm joined by my colleague, Rachel Myers, who is also a senior research assistant at Cal. And please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're calling from. Also, feel free to add a little information about your teaching context, such as the ages of your students and the languages you teach. A little bit about the organizations that are sponsoring this webinar today. We have the Center for Applied Linguistics, which is a nonprofit organization located in Washington, D.C., whose mission is to promote language learning and cultural understanding by serving as a trusted source for research, resources, and policy analysis. And this webinar is also presented by the AELRC, which is a language resource center whose mission is to facilitate useful assessment and evaluation practices that help language educators innovate and improve their programs, ensure accountability to students and society, and articulate the value of foreign language studies in the world today. The purpose of today's webinar is to develop an understanding of the purposes and principles of rubrics, to learn about the different types of rubrics that can be used to assess student performances, and to learn best practices for creating and adapting rubrics for the world language classroom, using rubrics to measure and provide feedback on student performances, and aligning rubrics to standards and within your program. By the end of today's webinar, you'll be able to define rubric and describe different types of rubrics, understand some best practices for creating or adapting, using, and aligning rubrics, and reflect on experiences with rubrics in your own contexts. So to start us off, we'll do a little demonstration, and Rachel and I will demonstrate on the Zoom whiteboard. You can follow along on a piece of paper or using your preferred drawing program, such as Microsoft Paint. So, Rachel and everyone else, please draw a picture that features nature.
Okay, and I'm going to open a whiteboard that will be shared with everyone. So if you also click on whiteboard, you will be able to see what I'm drawing. So I've opened that now, and now I am drawing a picture that features nature. Okay. I'm done.
That's very nice, but I was really looking for something more creative that really focuses on nature. And it would be great if the lines were a bit cleaner too.
Okay, I'm scrolling over a little bit to the right. You can do that in your whiteboard too. And now here's my second drawing. There's my second drawing.
Thank you. I like how this one really focuses on nature. I think it's more creative and neater than the last one, but I do think it's still pretty basic. Can you make it more complex?
Yes, okay, I'm scrolling over further, and would you look at this? I'll perform some magic and add my finished drawing here. So there we go, there's my third drawing.
Wow, that is exactly what I was looking for. Thank you. All right, so I will share my screen again. And let's think about the components that I considered when I was rating these drawings. So first, I asked for more creativity. Then I also wanted the drawing to be neater. And finally, I asked for something that was more complex, which would show Rachel's level of skill. So let's think about what characterized that final drawing. It was creative, which meant it had a variety of components that aren't seen in everyday life. Neatness refers to things like smooth lines that meet without gaps and consistent coloring. and Rachel showed their level of skill by successfully doing something that is challenging for people to do. So as this activity shows, having consistent criteria not only makes it easier to rate a performance, but it also made it easier for the student to know what is expected. The first drawing really did feature nature, but if I had asked for a landscape from the start, I may have gotten the kind of drawing I was looking for on the first try. So now I will turn it over to Rachel to bring this back to rubrics.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Okay, I will share my screen now and start presenting. There we go. Okay, so what does this activity have to do with rubrics? How does this relate? A rubric is a coherent set of criteria for students' work that identifies the most important qualities of the work and includes descriptors of levels of performance quality on those criteria. So just like in the drawing activity, a rubric helps us list what is expected and define a measure of quality for each of those expectations. There are many reasons to use rubrics. Rubrics can improve consistency of grading and reduce bias. They can promote shared expectations across teachers, help teachers and learners clarify goals, monitor progress over time, and make grading easier and faster. Do any other purposes for using rubrics come to mind to you? Please type your answers into the chat box on Zoom and I can read out a couple of them. Okay, Catherine says that rubrics foster learner autonomy. Zakia says they help students assess their own work. Dawn says using rubrics promotes consistency among graders. Someone else says it reduces bias. Yeah, I agree with all of this as well. Yeah, I think that learner autonomy is another very important point to add to this list. So before we go on, let's take a look at another tool, a related tool, the checklist. Checklists also have criteria for a performance, but they only have two levels, such as yes and no or pass and fail. This can make them easier and faster to use, as well as clearer, less arbitrary, and more consistent. They can be especially good for self and peer assessment. However, they often need to be closely tailored to a specific activity, and it can be harder to capture some criteria, especially more complex ones like organization and sophistication. One of the biggest differences from rubrics is that checklists do not provide a sense of the relative quality of a performance. There's no way to capture partial achievement of a criterion or of the difference between work that minimally meets a standard and work that excels. So checklists and rubrics each have their place in instruction, but they do have some important differences. Here is an example of a sample checklist that could be used for a classroom-based interpersonal formative assessment task. So you see here that there are 4 different criteria, and whoever is scoring, whether that's the teacher or the student themselves, can check off yes or no for each criteria. One way to administer a task that uses a checklist like this would be to give all of the students the task instructions as well as another activity to do. And when everyone else is working on that second independent activity, the teacher could walk around the class and ask pairs to do the task as the teacher comes to them. This gives the students a copy of the checklist with comments right afterwards in that formative way so that feedback can be immediate and helpful. Now let's talk about a few different types of rubrics. First of all is a holistic rubric. This kind of rubric gives a single overall score for a performance. It's often used in large-scale assessments, such as, for example, standardized test or the ACTFL oral proficiency interview. And holistic rubrics tend to be quicker to use. Our second type of rubric is an analytic rubric. This rubric gives separate ratings on multiple components, such as fluency, accuracy, and complexity of a spoken response. Analytic rubrics are often used in classroom assessment because they provide more feedback. They can also allow you to weight some parts more heavily than others, which may be useful for emphasizing areas you want students to focus on or improve. We will show examples of both types and then focus on analytic rubrics during the second half of our webinar today when we talk about creating, using, and aligning rubrics. So here is our example holistic rubric from Carla, the Center for Advanced Research on Language Acquisition at the University of Minnesota. And we'll share links to a lot of these Carla resources later in the webinar. Note that this is a holistic rubric for a role-playing task at the intermediate level. So take a moment to look at the levels and the descriptors and try to identify the criteria for each level of performance. Here we see 3 levels: exceeds expectations, meets expectations, and approaching expectations, each with many criteria within them. And then also here is an example of an analytic rubric, again from Carla. So again, take a moment to look at the criteria, the levels, and the descriptors, and think about the similarities and differences from the holistic rubric from the last slide. Note that this is a generic rubric for interpersonal tasks for novice learners in grades K through 4. There are this time 3 separate criteria and 3 different levels within each criteria, and then some descriptors for each of those boxes. So now let's compare and contrast the holistic and analytic rubrics. Leslie will put the attachments into the chat so that you can see the samples while reflecting. And then use the chat box on Zoom. Please share some similarities and differences that you notice between the 2 sample rubrics. You can think about the following questions: what criteria are included? What types of descriptors are used? How can you use prioritization and weighting? How can you address ranges of performance? And what are the advantages of different rubrics? And we'll also take a look at our own comparisons afterwards as well. Ruth says the analytic one is clear and precise for me. Kruti says the holistic rubric gives clear characteristics, but could be tricky to score with because score distributions are not included. The analytic rubric gives students more opportunities to succeed because it's not all or nothing. Thanks, Adrienne, that's interesting. Great, thank you. All right, so this chart shows our comparison of holistic and analytic rubrics to help you decide which one is appropriate for your needs at different times. So holistic rubrics do not provide specific feedback on different aspects of performance, while analytic rubrics do. Analytic rubrics also let you weight different criteria if you choose, which you can't do with a holistic rubric. However, holistic rubrics may be faster to create and use, while the specificity of analytic rubrics means they tend to take more time. Here we want to show you a sample rubric on rubrics that can help you judge the quality of the rubrics that you make. So let's take a look at some of the criteria and descriptors here. And specifically, let's look at the middle section where it says descriptors and key elements. So as we can see, rubrics that fall in the highest category over here have explicit descriptors that clearly distinguish between levels of quality, while lower quality rubrics, maybe under the 2 or the 1 over here, may lack some clarity. Similarly, a high quality rubric assesses only the key elements of the task, measures only vital elements which are critical to the task, no items of low consequence, whereas a lower scoring rubric may include some less significant elements. Now let's talk about 2 more types of rubrics. So in addition to being holistic or analytic, rubrics can also be generic or task specific. So a generic rubric can be used for multiple tasks. For example, you may have one rubric that can be adapted for use with all your interpretive listening tasks or all of your interpersonal signing tasks. A task-specific rubric, on the other hand, is designed for one specific task. For example, you may have different rubrics for each of your interpretive listening tasks and each of your interpersonal signing tasks. Another example would be presentational writing. So if your students write a newspaper article, you may use a different rubric than if they write a tourist brochure, even though those are both presentational writing tasks. Let's take a look at some examples of generic and task-specific rubrics. So here is an example generic rubric for interpersonal tasks. As you can see, the criteria in the left-hand column could be applied in many interpersonal speaking situations. For example, this last criteria has to do with demonstrating cultural knowledge, and a strong performance is characterized by using culturally appropriate expressions and gestures during the conversation. So that's pretty generic, right? So what does culturally appropriate expressions and gestures mean? That could vary depending on what the specific student is trying to do, or that could vary across different languages. But the teacher could determine that, know that in their mind for each task, and use this same rubric across many tasks. On the other hand, here is an example of a task-specific rubric for a presentational writing task that's specifically about visiting monuments in Paris. As you can see, this one is more tailored to the story format that's used in this task. It is also more specific about the tenses that are used and the content of the writing, which focuses on monuments. So compare the descriptors for the cultural knowledge criteria and notice that how much more specific they are than they were in the generic rubric. So again, in the bottom row here, use of cultural knowledge. Here, a strong performance is characterized by including the current and historical significance of all monuments pictured. So it mentions the monuments right there. This rubric is designed for the task specifically about monuments. Let's take a moment now to reflect on our own experiences with different kinds of rubrics. So please type your answers in the chat on Zoom. What types of rubrics are you familiar with? What do you find helpful about each type of rubric? And what do you find challenging about each type of rubric? And we'll read these out too. Adrian says, when holistic rubrics have multiple criteria, it's difficult not to use them as if they were analytic. Yeah, definitely. If you see like one line that has 6 descriptors within it, and you might think, oh, the student is doing 4 of these really well, but in 2 of them, they're on the next level down or the next level up. So you're already thinking about it in an analytic way. Carla says it's challenging to know how to convert them to grades. That's a great point. Yeah, a score on a rubric is not the same as scoring an A for the day or an A for the test. So it can be a different question or a different consideration to think about how do different scores on a particular rubric translate to grades in your setting. And that's really, I would say that can be challenging, and that's often because it has to be very specific to your specific context. Carol says it's challenging how students understand or interpret rubrics themselves, sometimes hard even if we discuss them. Yeah, that can definitely be true. I think it can often be helpful to do self and peer assessment with the rubric to give them some of that hands-on experience with the different criteria and how they apply. And Leslie will also talk in a few minutes about how to adapt rubrics to make them accessible to younger learners, which can have separate considerations. For time restriction, using holistic rubric is more convenient. However, specific rubric for intermediate, high, and advanced level is more appropriate. Yeah, and then kind of similar, really interesting comment from Jessica saying she always uses analytic task-specific rubrics at the master's level, the master's level courses she teaches, where the students are already teachers, because those students want really detailed information and feedback. Yeah, that's a great example of tailoring your rubric to the specific students in context, and you already know what they want and need. Lina also says it's helpful to create a rubric with your students depending on the grade and subject. Definitely, we'll talk about that a bit as well. And I see a couple of comments talking about needing more training to give the same scores when using the same rubric and the importance of that scoring calibration to make your scoring fair. Yeah, definitely. That's a really important consideration. Okay, thank you very much for your answers. That was great to see. And I will turn things back over to Leslie to talk about creating, using, and aligning rubrics.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, so when you're creating a rubric, it's a good idea to use backward design principles, which means that you start with what you want to know. What do you want your assessment and rubric to tell you about what students can do? And then you determine what evidence would show that students can do that. Then, using that information, you create a rubric that captures those key elements. So when you think about the purpose of your assessment, you can ask yourself questions like, What are students demonstrating that they can do? What skills do students need to complete the assessment successfully? How will I use the information gathered from the assessment? For example, if you want to measure students' progress, you may want to keep the same criteria as you used on a previous assessment. While if you want to identify areas for improvement, you may include new criteria that students are ready to focus on. And then you can also think about what type of rubric would be best for evaluating and providing feedback on students' performances. Let's look at 2 example assessments. As we go through this section of the webinar, we'll create and adapt rubrics for both of these. So our first assessment looks at novice interpersonal speaking skills as students introduce themselves and discuss their interests or hobbies. So to complete this assessment, students will need to use phrases and some sentences, memorized questions, and vocabulary that they have practiced in class. The assessment will be used to identify areas for improvement, so an analytic rubric may be the most helpful to give targeted feedback. For our second assessment, students will write an article supporting their position on a proposed law. This assesses advanced presentational writing skills. To successfully complete this task, students will need to understand many perspectives and organize their writing. The information gathered from this assessment will be used to assign grades. So an analytic rubric could be helpful to give targeted feedback, or a holistic rubric may be best to give one overall grade for the performance. It would depend on your context, your students, just like Rachel was saying, and how you want to use the rubric exactly. Now let's create our rubrics. Here are the steps we're going to follow. First, we'll brainstorm possible criteria. We want these to be the elements that are essential to complete the task successfully. Then we'll narrow down that list of possible criteria and select the most important ones. We recommend using the ACTFL proficiency guidelines as a resource for selecting criteria, and you may also have standards that apply to your specific context that could help you decide as well. Once you have your criteria, you can choose the levels of the rubric. 3, 4, and 5-point scales are common for the levels. Then you want to write descriptions for each criterion at each level. Then you should try out your rubric with a few students and be prepared to share and discuss the rubric with your students and other stakeholders. All right, so let's start brainstorming our criteria. When you brainstorm your criteria, think about what knowledge and skills are required for the assessment. What is required to successfully complete the assessment? To help you determine this, you may want to review your learning objectives and compare them to the ACTFL standards. You may also want to look at your comments on students' previous work to see what characteristics you were noticing. You can also consider the quantity and quality of language you want students to produce. Once you have a preliminary list of criteria, group similar ones together and see if any can be combined or eliminated. Make sure you eliminate any non-essential criteria. Your final number of criteria may vary, but a common number would be about 5 to 7. Generally, you want to have enough to accurately describe students' work, but not so many that it's overwhelming. Also, some criteria may only apply to certain questions, such as a more complex final section of an assessment. Once you've narrowed down your criteria a bit, it's a good idea to do a quality check. You may want to ask yourself if your criteria are observable. For example, saying a student thinks about other perspectives would not be observable, but student discusses possible counter-arguments in their essay would be observable. So consider also whether your criteria are measurable. This won't necessarily be measurable the way distance or volume would be, but you want to be thinking about what your criteria mean. If one of your criteria is sophistication, do you have an idea of what makes writing sophisticated? You also want all criteria to be distinct from one another, not overlapping, and they should all be important for the assessment. Finally, you want to be sure that students will understand the criteria so they know what's being asked of them. Let's look at a few examples of criteria used in ACTFL's integrated performance assessment rubrics for different modes. As we can see, some criteria for the interpretive mode, which I will pull up here, include word recognition, main idea detection, supporting detail detection, organizational features, guessing meaning from context, inferences, and a few different kinds of perspectives. Then for the interpersonal mode rubric, we'll see that the criteria remain the same across proficiency levels. And those criteria are language function, text type, communication strategies, comprehensibility, and language control. And those are repeated across the intermediate level, intermediate high, and advanced. Even as those descriptions are changing to be more complex and reflect students' higher levels of proficiency. For the presentational mode, again, we will see that the criteria remain the same across levels. So here for the novice, we have language function, text type, just like for the interpersonal, impact, which is slightly different from what we saw before, and then comprehensibility and language control. And again, those stay the same across the other proficiency levels that we see here. All right. Now let's try it out. We'll practice brainstorming and selecting the criteria for a rubric using the example novice speaking assessment we shared earlier in the webinar, and that is here for your reference as well. In the chat box, please type 3 criteria you could include in your rubric. And of course, you can also adapt this for other interpersonal communication skills. So if you teach ASL, for instance, you can suggest criteria you would use, such as hand shapes. Okay, from Ashley, text type, language function, and content or vocabulary. Yes, similar to what we saw in those examples. From Adrienne, accurate vocabulary, sentence control, and coherence. Vocabulary is a popular one coming in from Hongmei and Lena. Hongmei also says coherency and culture awareness, very important in the language classroom. Yes, Zakia suggests basing the criteria on can-do statements, which ACTFL has published, and those describe what students at different proficiency levels can do. And we also see things like, from Kruti, use of appropriate vocabulary linked to the knowledge of hobbies and use of accurate sentence structures. Yes, thank you, everyone. Those are great. We will return to those criteria in a few minutes. Next, you want to choose the levels of your rubric. You may want to think about the highest and lowest levels of performance you can expect and how many levels you can distinguish in between those points. When choosing the number of categories, you want to avoid having a catch-all middle category, which you may notice happening once you use the rubric. So if you notice that, think about how you can break up that category to distinguish more between performances. Also, try to aim for an equal distance between your levels. You don't want to jump from a very low level to a high level and then a small step to an excellent level beyond that. As I said before, 3, 4, and 5-point scales are common, and a popular example of this would be exceeds, meets, and does not meet expectations for the different criteria. Once you have your criteria and your levels, you can create a chart like this one to start building the rubric. Then you should write descriptors for each criterion at each level. That's each cell or box in the chart we just saw. When you're writing these, think about what characterizes performance at each level and describe the language that students will produce. It's helpful to use similar descriptors across the scale. For example, you might say uses general and minimal topic-specific vocabulary for one level, and then uses general and a range of topic-specific vocabulary for the next. You wouldn't want to suddenly switch and say uses complex and sophisticated vocabulary, because that doesn't show how the vocabulary progresses across levels. Also, you may want to use similar descriptions across criteria. If you describe the range of vocabulary as limited, basic, good, or strong, then you may also want to describe students' intercultural knowledge as limited, basic, good, or strong. Your descriptors should also indicate how well the standards are met, and they should not overlap. If you say some use of specialized vocabulary for one level and partial use of specialized vocabulary for the next, those aren't particularly different, and you may be confused and inconsistent when it comes time to use your rubric. Let's look at these example descriptors for interpersonal speaking from the state of Ohio. They have some great language rubrics on their Department of Education website. So how do their criteria and levels compare to the ones you put in the chat a few minutes ago? We're seeing vocabulary, language control, fluency I saw in the chat, pronunciation came up a bit. Content, we didn't talk about as much before, but of course it's an important aspect of any task, whether they are achieving the communicative goal of the task. And we also saw those cultural factors too. Okay. Another thing is that the descriptors here, we can see things like strong range of vocabulary, good range, basic range, and limited range. And we're seeing how those progress across those different levels. Now let's look at creating descriptors for an assessment you might use with older students. We'll refer to our sample assessment where students write an article supporting their position on a proposed law. So for this, let's look at the performance descriptors from the ACTFL World Readiness Standards for the Advanced Proficiency Range. These are aligned to the standards, and they describe the language performance of learners in standards-based, performance-based world language classrooms. This can help give you some ideas for the criteria that help characterize writing at this level, which you can use when making your criteria and your descriptors. So some descriptors that I'm seeing here are organized, detailed, various timeframes, topic-specific content, and the use of target language and culture conventions. These can form the basis of my criteria, and then the descriptors can draw on the range presented here from organized writing and basic needs at advanced low to significant precision and the use of target language culture and culture conventions at advanced high. So here's what those descriptors might look like. As you can see, at the high end, I have chosen descriptors that emphasize the use of topic-specific vocabulary, strong organization, and the use of target language and culture conventions, while the lower levels have less range of vocabulary, more errors, and limited use of target language and culture conventions. You can also see how I tried to make sure the descriptors did not overlap, such as here for details and support. I might be able to improve on that for content, for example. I could clarify the distinction between minimally meeting and partially meeting the communicative goal. Once you have your rubric drafted, you should give it a try with a few students. If you can't do that for practical reasons, like needing to keep your test prompts secure until test day, then you may want to try grading past samples of student work using the rubric, because the goal is to see whether the rubric is working as intended. When you're testing it out, check if any criteria or descriptors seem fuzzy, where you're not really sure what you were trying to measure, or where a term you used in the rubric isn't clearly defined. Then, if you're having trouble distinguishing between adjacent levels, see if you can clarify your descriptors. And as I mentioned before, if most of your students are falling into a catch-all middle category, you may need to add more levels to distinguish between different qualities of work. You should be prepared to share your rubrics with students, teachers, and other stakeholders. To make your rubrics easier to share with students, make sure your descriptors are learner-friendly and age-appropriate. You can consider simplifying your rubrics to share with your students, but make sure that the expectations are still consistent with the rubrics you will use for assessment. Again, so students know what the expectations are and how they'll be assessed. Some teachers like to use a smile or frown indicator for younger students too, especially when making checklists. If multiple teachers plan to use the same rubric, you want to be sure that different teachers will apply the rubric in the same way for different assessments and different students. So to help with this, you can develop examples of student performance at each level, along with explanations justifying the score. Then you can discuss the rubrics with your colleagues to make sure you have a shared understanding of how they will be applied. Sometimes you might need to or choose to adapt an existing rubric rather than creating one from scratch. This can be faster, and it can be easier to align rubrics across classrooms if they're adapted from the same source. However, creating your own rubrics means you can customize them to your specific needs from the beginning. So as always, we recommend considering your context when deciding which approach will work best for you. When adapting a rubric, it helps to start from a rubric that is already aimed at a similar purpose, whether that's the intended level, the type of assessment, or the communicative mode. Then consider the purpose of your assessment and edit the criteria, levels, and descriptors accordingly. For instance, if the rubric is for presentational speaking and you would like to adapt it for presentational writing, you may want to adjust the descriptors for organization and language control to reflect the fact that we tend to use more complex sentences when writing than when speaking. Also, keep the valuable parts of the existing rubric. For example, the rubric may have useful descriptors for the range of vocabulary that students use. You can keep those descriptors and even use the same terminology in your descriptors for other criteria. Then, when you have finished adapting your rubric, you want it to fulfill all of the qualities that we previously discussed. So make sure that it includes the essential criteria for your assessment, clear descriptors for each criterion at each level, and a logical progression of levels that will help you and your students understand the expectation for the assessment. Let's look at our example rubric from Ohio and how it can be adapted to be more student-friendly for younger learners. Here we have some descriptors at the top, and we can see that it's using some high-level vocabulary, such as participates minimally in the conversation or communicative goal exceeded. That may be a little harder for younger learners to understand, so we can adapt this for those students by saying things like participates a little bit, or I get my point across using a lot of details. We can also be clear about what it means to use some practiced questions to continue the conversation. Will students know what counts as a practiced question? By saying, I ask some questions that we practiced in class, we can make that more clear for students. I've also shifted the language down here in this adapted example into the first person using I statements to help give students a sense of ownership over their learning and promote self-assessment. When you're creating or adapting rubrics, consider how your rubrics align with standards and with other rubrics being used across and within grade levels and courses. Aligning rubrics can lead to more consistency within a course and across a program, as well as greater correspondence with standards. You may also see increased familiarity with the rubric as students have encountered them before in other classes. For best alignment, rubrics for each communicative mode you're assessing in your classroom or program should have the same format and structure, the same criteria and number of levels, the same names for those criteria and levels, and the same type of descriptors and a clear progression in the descriptors across levels. When you're looking at different rubrics for different communicative modes, as well as across courses, you can have the same broad criteria based on a shared resource, such as standards or the actual IPA rubrics, those integrated performance assessment rubrics that we looked at earlier, and 3 or 4 levels of evaluation, different descriptors that match the student's proficiency in the unit theme, but still parallel language and formatting in terms of appearance and whether they're holistic or analytic. Let's work on aligning our 2 example rubrics. First, we'll want to be sure that the levels correspond. And a quick note that I changed this for the presentational writing from Ohio, whereas before we were looking at an interpersonal rubric. So as I mentioned, the levels over here, the levels go from the lowest level to the highest, whereas here on the right, they go from the highest level to the lowest. And they also use different names for the different categories. So we would want to make those match. We'll flip that one around. Then let's look at our first row. They're both called vocabulary, which is good. We want to use the same criteria, but the descriptors are a bit different. So the one here on the left talks about topic-specific vocabulary, while the one on the right mentions appropriate vocabulary. We would want to make those similar, so we need to decide what descriptor makes more sense for our context. Feel free to put in the chat which descriptor makes more sense in your context and why, appropriate vocabulary or topic-specific. And we should also align the descriptors. So we see here that the developing column here on the left doesn't quite match the others. We may want to adopt the descriptor from this developing column over on the right and say basic range of topic-specific vocabulary or appropriate vocabulary if that's the descriptor you chose. Now let's move down to our last row. We can see that the categories are similar, but they're not exactly the same. Over here on the right, we have a definition for intercultural competence. And it says cultural content, register, idiomatic expressions, daily life, intercultural similarities / differences. We may want to think about what our categories mean and what we want to address. For example, if we're focusing on intercultural comparisons, then we might want to keep intercultural competence. Whereas if we want students to really adopt the perspective of the target culture, we may want to focus more on the use of target language and culture conventions. For now, I'm going to stick with intercultural competence, so we'll revise our descriptors on the left to match those on the right. Now let's reflect on our own experiences using rubrics to measure student performance in our classrooms. So please add your answers in the chat box on Zoom. What is your experience creating or adapting, using, and aligning rubrics? What has been working well? What would you like to improve? What sources do you use to adapt or inspire your rubrics? And looking in the chat, I see that people are saying that they have some department rubrics that they use, that students are able to understand the expectations well thanks to rubrics, and also that people are adapting from sources like their state standards or state-provided rubrics and adapting those to their contexts. That's great. Thank you, everyone, for your answers. I'll turn it back over to Rachel to wrap things up and guide our discussion.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Okay. Here we go. All right, so we'll do a little bit more review and reflection now. So in this webinar, you learned how to define rubric and describe different types of rubrics, how to understand best practices for creating or adapting, using, and aligning rubrics. And you also learned how to reflect on your experiences with rubrics in your own context. So let's take a minute to reflect on what we've learned. We would love to hear from you in the chat. What is your biggest takeaway from this webinar, and how will you apply what you've learned? And we'll give everyone a few minutes to think about and type up those answers. After this, we'll also have time for an open Q&A if you have any just still unanswered questions. So Diane says this webinar gave me the idea to quote unquote test the rubric by working with others to rate previous assignments, then discuss our ratings. Yeah, great idea. A great way to make sure that you and your fellow teachers understand rubrics in the same way. And if you are developing a new rubric, to check out that it works for all of you. Alejandra says, I haven't used checklists and I think they can be useful in some situations. Yeah, definitely agreed, especially for quick, informative purposes. They definitely are helpful. Adrienne says, biggest takeaway is making sure rubrics are consistent internally and externally and applied consistently. Yep, so in addition to, I've spoken a lot about consistency of scoring, and Leslie also spoke a lot about consistency of rubrics across levels, maybe within a school or even within a district. Really important. Yeah, and I see a couple of people talking about they might try pre-testing or piloting their rubrics in the future, which is great. Okay, we will also move on to our open Q&A. So we have a few minutes for questions, and you can use the Q&A function on Zoom to type in your questions about the topics covered in this webinar, as well as any additional questions you have for us about rubrics that we did not cover today. Kruti, I see your question. You say, my query, how detailed should a rubric be? Since the rubrics are used by teachers to assess and students to learn from, we find it hard to balance the details in the rubric so that there is consistency in the interpretation of the rubrics. a great question. It's really key to think about how detailed a rubric should be when you're developing one or deciding on one to use. I would say I would emphasize the importance of thinking about what are the most important criteria that you want your students to focus on. So what are the, the washback effects of this rubric? How will they affect teaching and learning? And think about what is really key for a given kind of task, or even for one specific task. What do you really want students to be focusing on there? And make sure that that is in the rubric and kind of nothing else is. So this is getting at this idea of include everything that's really important and nothing that's not so important. And make sure also this depends on the age of your students and kind of how much meta knowledge maybe they have about language learning. If they are older or have a lot of practice with this, more details can be helpful. And if they're younger, they can just kind of get in the way. So yeah, no hard and fast rules. It's always context specific. But the guiding question here is what matters most for the students to get. I don't see any other questions coming in, so we'll move on to our conclusion, although in a couple of minutes we'll share our contact information too. So if you want to reach out to us separately, please do. But before we go, we do have a few more notes and additional resources to share, and we would also let you know about the evaluation we'd like you to complete to let us know what you liked about this webinar and what we can improve on in the future. So here are the references that were used throughout this presentation. We'll share these links in the chat, and we'll also be sharing the slides on our website later, so you can take a closer look at these resources. And the same thing for the examples that we used today. Again, these will be available in the slides that we will email out to registrants and post later. So those are things like our very fun rubric on rubrics. You can see all the examples we used today. If you would like to check out more resources from the AELRC and CAL focusing on assessment, you can visit our website by clicking on the links in this chat or by scanning the QR codes here. And we'll pop these QR codes back up on screen in a second as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. And please fill out the webinar evaluation by clicking, again, we'll put a link in the Zoom chat box, or by scanning the QR code here. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions so that we can continue offering webinars that are really helpful to all educators. So I'll give everyone a second to scan this. And then say, here is our contact information. You can email Leslie and I at our addresses shown here. You can also, again, visit the websites for AELRC and CAL to see more resources. And thank you so much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great.